Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to this presentation from the E39 project. Today we will have Frida K Vonstad presenting the development and interdisciplinary framework for collaborative borehole core testing. So I will give the word to you, Frida, but just one more information. The participants in this recording will not show unless you ask questions at the end of the presentation, and it is an opportunity to do that. So Frida, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Frida Vonstad, as Kjersti said. I'm a PhD student at UCL, University College London, doing a PhD in geotechnical engineering, where I'm studying the collaboration on the geological environment on development projects. So as you can see, and as Kjersti said, my research title is Developing an Interdisciplinary Framework for Collaborative Borehole Core Testing, with my supervisors being Dr. Pedro Ferreira from the Civil Engineering Department and Dr. Dean Sully from the Archaeological Department. So the reason that I am studying this is that currently there isn't a good way for the different disciplines in geology, the major ones being geology, geotechnical engineering, and geoarchaeology, that all perform very similar research tasks. So what I'm looking into is how we can better improve the collaboration for time and cost reduction, but also to create more efficient work practices that can enhance the larger picture for the geology of an area that we sit with in the end. So as you can see on this image, this was a case study in London where there wasn't enough archaeological research done, and they accidentally came across a cemetery, which then ended up delaying the project for about a year because there was massive excavations that needed to take place, and therefore the loss to the developer was massive. And this could have been prevented if further archaeological work had been done at the beginning, so that they could have had prior warning to what was currently on the site. So I've created this image here, as you can see, where some of the made ground, some of the geological environment is pointed to on what would be your left side. Here you can see what commonly would be recorded from a geotechnical borehole. So the geotechs would just measure out what the stratigraphy of the area was, versus for the archaeology on the right-hand side, you can see that there's a lot more detail that is recorded. So if you want to simplify it, geotechnicals, they more look at how can the stratigraphy affect the building, the construction, just a bit more practical, larger level stuff, whereas the archaeology looks more at the smaller level, the micro details, and how that can inform the historical environment of an area and how we can record that for future research, but also how that can inform the use of an area. And yeah, this image shows that fairly well. From the geology, you can see the wider historical environment of an area. So what I would like to do with my research is to try to bridge the gap between all these three disciplines. So I would like to ensure that on a site, rather than trying to squeeze in all of the research needed for geology, geoarchaeology, and geotechnical engineering, we can do a collaborative borehole research, a couple rather than several from everyone, where we can get all of this information gathered in one rather than doing the cost and the added risk of doing everything separately. So if you see it this way, you would save a lot of money and time for getting people in, which I will show in my pilot study, which was recently finished a bit later on. So the research aims for my project is to create more efficient work practices, reduce costs in terms of less teams needed to get onto sites and less expertise needed on site, and also reduce the risk for unexpected delays by being able to do wider research on the area without needing to have the extra cost and time for everybody to come into the area. So to do this, I'm creating a testing framework where you can place the information gained from collaborative boreholes, and from that be able to extract the information you need. I would like to create a foundation for further research in the area, as I believe that this can really help the efficiency and the further work to go on site to just be made in a way that, for example, on E39, you can gather a lot more information in a short period of time, and it can be recorded for future research. So the method that I'm using to do this, because this is a new field that we're talking about here. So to start it, I can't just base myself on work done. I can't just look up readings and place myself securely within it. I have to create my own environment surrounding it by looking into 3 different disciplines, which is intense. So I'm doing this by looking at case studies. What's the current practice? What is not working? How can we make it work better? I'm doing ethnographic fieldwork to establish this. Rather than just bring my own opinions, I'm going out to talk to academics, I'm talking to people in the field. I am getting feedback on what is working with what I'm suggesting, what isn't working, and how can we make it fit within the current procedure and current practice that's used on sites. This is very important to me because the research, in the end, I don't want it to be something that's academic pondering that will just be put on a shelf, but something that actively can be taken a hold of and implemented by developers without causing any large change within the current organization. So the ethnographic fieldwork is quite an important path to just settling it in the current environment, both for development and also to ensure not a large change in practice is needed. So the testing framework as well, a really important part of it, the main deal of the project. So I am creating the framework. I've extracted the most important parts of what is gained from geology, from geotechnical engineering, and geoarchaeology. What is the main areas that people look for, and what sort of tests and analysis do they need to be able to get a full picture for their separate disciplinary needs? So I want to make a streamlined, this is the tests that we need, but also can everybody get everything they need from those tests, or will people have reduced materials? Will they have reduced results? How can we make sure everybody sits back with something that they actually can work with and make a full conclusion from? So this process started with desk-based investigations. It has continued into interviews, which will go on throughout the project to make sure I get feedback on every stage that I go through. Onto field observations, which has happened on some case studies in London, and that will take place on E39 as well. The framework development has come from the interviews, the field observations, but also all the desk observations that I've made on what the specific requirements are for everyone. And in the end, this will then be tested in the field, hopefully on E39 or on a large-scale project in London. So the testing framework, as I just mentioned, it is constantly under development based on feedback and based on information that I get from the case studies. What's working, what's missing, how can we fill those gaps properly for everyone? So this is just a little flow chart that I made just to kind of explain how I'm seeing this. So I start with the geotechnical borehole data. I start here because this is something that's done on pretty much every development site. So we know that this data will be present in some way or another. So from that, how can we identify the missing data? What do we need to expand from this? What's the micro detail that we're not getting, and how can we get that? Can we get that from the data in the geotechnical analysis? Can we add something to it without disturbing too much the process that's already in place? And then from that, you expand on the data. So I'm doing some case studies where I'm looking at just the geotechnical borehole data, can we extract just from that? Other ones where we're trying to add extra layers. So we're doing a geotechnical borehole data as is common practice, but also we're adding some extra analysis based on what is expected to find in the environment, but also what did we see was missing from the other ones. So from this, we're then going to see how can we extract the data needed. And then we have, at a further level, exchanged the knowledge between them. When we have all this data, how can we actually make the different disciplines collaborate on the results that's gained? Currently, we see that if there is extensive archaeology done or geology done, they don't really communicate that very well within the teams to other members in other disciplines. So how can we encourage that to happen a bit more? And how can we, through sharing this knowledge, inform construction of potential risks that we can encounter? And how can that then reduce the risk by further communication, but also to make sure that the exchange has happened in a proper way? Everybody has all the information they need. And from that, there should be a collaborative document at the end coming from everyone, in addition to their specific disciplinary ones. So as you can see, the flowchart go from geotechnical engineering, geological archaeology, to geology. The reason that geology come as a third is because I think geotechnical engineering can inform geological archaeology fairly well, and geology can answer most of their analysis from taking information from those two. That's the feedback that I've gotten from academics at this point, but I'm always open to discussion on the subject. So some of the big issues with this is, what is the right amount of data? What's too much? What's too little? I'm trying to be in contact with everybody involved. From in England, it's a separate process of gathering the geotechnical data and analyzing the data. There's usually different firms doing this, so I'm trying to get information from all levels of it, but also how can we use the knowledge to predict the risk? If we have certain data, can we use this to create a risk analysis of, if you've gathered so much data, the risk for surprise archaeology goes down, or if you don't gather certain data, the risk goes up. This could also be a very good way of encouraging the collaboration. So I'm going to continue forward on a test of this framework that I've done. I'm not going to go into full detail because it recently finished and I don't have all the permission to use the data. So I'm just going to briefly go over how I've used it, how I've thought about it, and yeah. So the pilot framework study took place in Bermondsey in London. The case studies are spread between London and Norway on E39. And this case study, it was very challenging for a couple of different reasons. So the development project, it's a lot smaller than what we see now on E39. It was just a residential development of World War II buildings. But the area that they're in is in an archaeological priority zone, which means that there's a high chance of important finds that can inform about the use of early London, how did it develop through the stages. So in this area, it was particularly important to find environmental finds because it is predicted that very early humans used this area for residential purposes, and there's a lot of evidence that has been found in the surrounding area around the site. Directly around it, a lot of important evidence has been found. So for this case study, originally, the archaeological team had set up quite an expansive archaeological investigation, but the developers changed midway through the process, and the teams found that they would not be allowed access on the sites. They were denied to come on to do the boreholes they'd planned. They were denied to come to really do anything but to do a watching brief. And watching briefs on site pretty much means that when the geotechnical engineers did their boreholes and did their tests on site, their pits, they were merely allowed to watch and go through some of the spoil heaps that were taken up from the sediment. One of the biggest problems with this versus doing their own, again, the scale. of detail that's looked at is different, but also that the areas that's selected to do these tests are different from what archaeologists would choose. So engineers would choose them out from where do they see any uncertainty on the site. There was a foundation wall that they did pits next to. The boreholes were close to where they thought they would found different utilities under the ground. So these were done in kind of what we would label as disturbed soil. So disturbed means that it's not intact in the way in the historical layers that can inform archaeology in a good way. So for archaeologists, we would have chosen a quite different area to do these tests on, simply because we would then have got information that both went a bit deeper in the layers, but that also weren't disturbed by later development. So for this site, the archaeological work that was done on a priority area was minimal, and the work that was observed was in areas that was not relevant. So when I decided to look at this case study was to see, okay, we did a bunch of boreholes here. Can we extract archaeological information purely from those? What information can be gained? What's missing? How could that be added to? And could perhaps that addition come purely from boreholes in the area? So in London, there's quite a public, large depository of borehole cores. So you can pretty much go online and you can see what everybody else in the area has recorded from their boreholes. So I just want to explain quickly what you're looking at the screen. So at the top spreadsheet, you can see some of the most important things that's gathered, both from a geotechnical and a geoarchaeological perspective, which is moisture, color, consistency, structure, soil type, other features. This is merely where more detailed scale for archaeology comes in. Origin or genesis, which is kind of the historical environmental buildup that we see on the site, and groundwater. So there's a bit more detail here that perhaps you would want to look through yourself. I'm not going to read through all of them, but here are the most important things that we can expect for everyone to share interest and knowledge on. What we actually found on the site was extremely limited. Most of the tests that were done were to prove groundwater, to see some of the top sediment structure. They weren't going to go very deep, but also to look for residue for bombs. As I said, this was a World War II area development, and they were looking for certain chemical mixes to see how the soil was, if there was any spills there, if there was a predicted bombs left in the area. So I've labeled up a couple of things that was found. This didn't come up very well. Apologies for that. So what we would like for archaeology as a minimum would be organic objects. Is this mentioned? Sediment, structure, and the boundary of all of those. There was some sediment done. It wasn't the full structure done. There were no organics logged, despite some being briefly mentioned in the reports. Characteristics and color were not mentioned. Grain size, they had some mentions of them, but none that could be used for archaeological purposes. The made ground. There was some made ground mentioned. None were able to be used for archaeological purposes because, as I said, they dug up the trial pits and we were allowed to go through spoil heaps. But if you find something in a spoil heap and you can't pinpoint where in a stratigraphy that's from, you can't say what level it's from. There were some pieces of pottery that were found and you could not pinpoint the timing or what layer they were from, so you couldn't apply that to the rest of the site to make any deduction from that. Archaeological features, there were some Roman features shown there, but again, couldn't be recorded properly. There were no thin sections taken. So for geological archaeology, you also look at things like pollen, microfossils, to establish the environment that was there, especially in alluvial landforms, like what we saw here. This was close to the River Thames, which was expected to be fairly close up at that point. This could also tell us more about the use of the area. All in all, we're missing most of the detail that we are expecting, which is fine. For the pilot study, what we wanted to establish was more what's not there, what can't be used. And this is a pretty powerful case study to be made in a London setting, because this is a very important area to pinpoint. You can go from early Iron Age all the way up to today's age. You can see everything on this site. Everything can be recorded, but there was no access given. There was only geotechnical work done, minimal geotechnical work. And this is the outcome from that. There's no usable information that can be seen in the middle of an area of archaeological importance with large sites of finds close by. So the information was minimal. There was a complete absence of environmental testing, which is, it's very bad. It's pretty much a black hole now in that area. And the archaeological conclusions were unable to be made. The only things that could be said was that archaeological finds were made, but none that could be dated, none that could be recorded in a stratigraphy, and none that could actually get information on land use and the prehistoric land surfaces that were mentioned for the site. So again, this is the first of the studies that I'm doing. The next ones will be what can be added to these geotechnical boreholes to expand the scope enough that it can be used for archaeology and geology. So I am waiting to get confirmation on what case studies I can do this on in E39. I'm very, very excited for this. It gives an impact when people on major developments like E39 can use this sort of framework. The interdisciplinary work is very important, and to have a mega project apply it, it really helps to support the claims that this can be used in all developments, large and small. So for E39, I'm hoping to test out the framework with expanded scopes for the boreholes. I'm hoping to get that confirmed and started by summer 2020. In addition to the case studies, I just want to explain a little bit more about the ethnographic fieldwork. I don't think I need to say very much on this more for you, but I guess it needs to be explained a bit more because it's social science and hard science put together. So for those who are not very much in the social science scene, it consists of formal interviews, informal interviews, participant observation, which means that you are in a field observing what people are doing and saying, but you're not actively trying to change any actions that's going on. Collection of text, in this case, we would call it more the procedure and standards that's being followed, and collecting images like the one I showed you in the introduction of the skeleton with the pile going through from lacks of investigations done. So I found the ethnographic fieldwork to be extremely helpful in my case, as I said, because there's a lack of documentation surrounding what I'm studying. This has been what has helped me really narrow down what is needed, how can it be applied, what do people think will work, what do they not think will work, and how can I, as best possible, try to aid their work practice with my work. So moving on from here, I'm continuing with my case studies. It will be quite an intense couple of months now of further data collection, particularly from the case studies. So I'm gaining a lot of documentation from some that I'm trying to apply to my framework, in addition to applying some of the expanded scope frameworks to other case studies. The data analysis of this will take a couple of months, but I am expecting to finish by next summer, which is incredibly exciting. I also have some publications pending for this, and we're getting there. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have some interesting questions. I'll be very happy to answer those.
Thank you, Frida. And then we open up for questions. So if anyone has one. I could start off with one. I was wondering, when you do your, the groundwork, do you also look at other methods such as LiDAR scanning, underground penetration scanning, and such?
It can be added to. There's a wide range. The LiDAR scanning now is being used by so many geological fields to help inform further what action needs to be taken on site. The research is already quite large, so I don't think it's something that I will have scope to include now, but I am very interested in continuing this research after my PhD to really help get a better practice in place for collaborative work, and I do think LiDAR will be a great aid to do so.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to ask a question? No? Then I'll continue with another question. I have a few. I was wondering, you showed us, the way that they record these types of investigations in London. And I also know that in Norway we have all the municipalities have a recording, and also within the NPRA we have a system. Are you familiar with that, or have you talked to the people that are responsible for those systems?
I have not had contact with the Norwegian engineering side of things. I've had contact with the archaeological standards that's followed. I find that to be the easiest way to start to find out what's ideally needed, and then you kind of narrow it down to the standards that engineers used. So the process in Norway is still ongoing as I'm waiting for the case studies. I can't really fully prepare it yet until I have everything in place, but I do find the standards in Norway to be a lot less confusing than what I've seen in England so far. England is a bit overwhelming with a lot of the EU standards, a lot of the local standards, and London has a whole set of separate ones in addition because it's an extra challenging area. So I am looking forward to getting to know the Norwegian procedures more, and I do think that what can be used is very encouraging from what I've heard from academics in Norway so far and from the people I've talked to on E39. So there's actually been suggestions I've learned recently before of trying to do collaborative borehole testing in Norway, but this has not been implemented as it wasn't something, again, it's a new area. Nobody had really looked into this before, and it was seen kind of as a wild dream. But I'm very happy now to be here and try to implement this more for Norway. And hopefully this can, especially on big projects like E39, it can really start to make the way for more interdisciplinary research to take place.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that. Okay, do we have anyone else? No? Okay, could I ask you a more overall question? I don't know if you have looked into it yet, but as you know, since I'm responsible for the E39, I always look into how does your research help my project? And how could you, with your research, do you have any idea of how much money it is possible to save by doing this this way?
That it's difficult because I don't have the costs for archaeological work on your sites as it now. It's quite different, I think, for each site for you.
It would
So I
be,
think I could
yes.
do costs for separate sites, such as I think around Bergen they might be a little bit higher because of the archaeological importance in that area. But in other more desolate stretches, I think that the costs would be lower because you wouldn't anticipate to encounter as much archaeology, but more to kind of record the geological historical environment in case it's needed in the future to have that recorded. So I would say if implemented properly. So I'm just comparing this to London cost right now, which might be a bit higher. On a London site, any site, if you want to do separate archaeological boreholes, you will be looking at maybe £2,000-3,000 minimum to do a couple of boreholes. This is because of a lot of cost with getting people on sites, but also because of the added cost for the expertise needed. So if we could look at sites in London compared to perhaps what a big city, like if it goes through the capital of Bergen, the cost would maybe be a couple of thousands. That's reduced just from the archaeological perspective. From the environmental/geological perspective, I would suggest that the cost is a little bit lower because they don't take as many borehole cores at the time. But I would say that in UK pounds, we're talking cost savings per, I don't want to estimate how large of an area, but I would say maybe £10,000 per area you could save by that. But I think the biggest saving isn't just in cost. The bigger saving is in the reduction of risk that you encounter by actually collaborating. So you can talk about the cost of doing the initial test, that's fine. But if you talk about the costs of delaying a project by months up to a year, there was recently a case study in Kjerringsundet in Norway where they found a lot, over 1,000 archaeological remains, and it delayed the project for a whole year. You can imagine the cost for crews and construction to be at hold for such a long time. Then we're talking vast sums that could have been saved by doing more expansive research at the beginning. So I think my research doesn't just focus at directly how do you save at the beginning, but in the bigger picture, how can you save by reducing the risk that you have for having longer delays for your project and manpower on hold for a longer period of time. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it did. And also maybe the environmental side of the story, that you don't need to do as many boreholes and such.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. I think that concludes my questions, and since I still have not heard, no, but then I think I will stop the recording and say thank you, Frida, for a great presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.